Hi everyone, and welcome to the lecture video, A Brief History of Research Ethics. Today, ethical guidelines play a significant role in the research process, but it wasn't always that way. Part of the emphasis on ethics in today's world comes from our recognition of our extreme mistakes in the past. In this video lecture, I want to talk about some of the major unethical research studies that have driven us towards the development of modern research ethics. In particular, unethical medical research studies have been a major driving force towards our modern protection for human subjects. Now here are the research studies that I'm going to highlight in this lecture. This list is by no means comprehensive, and it does not recognize many of the other ethical concerns that we have seen in historical research. But each of these studies has been an important factor in developing modern research ethic guidelines and procedures, so I want to share a bit about each study with you. One of the most notorious unethical research examples is the Nazi research that was done at the World War II concentration camps. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum notes that Nazi experiments served three major purposes. First, they were designed to assist with war efforts by identifying ways to increase survival rates of Axis military personnel. Low-pressure chamber experiments were used to identify max survival height for parachuting soldiers. Freezing experiments were used to identify possible hypothermia treatments, and seawater experiments sought ways to make seawater potable. All of the experiments were conducted on unwilling concentration camp prisoners, and they often ended with physical harm and potentially death for the prisoner. For example, the photograph on this slide shows the results of a high-altitude experiment. The second way experiments were used was to develop pharmaceuticals and disease treatments. Prisoners were exposed to contagious diseases like malaria, typhus, tuberculosis, etc., in order to use them as test subjects for immunization compounds. Prisoners were also subject to bone grafting experiments and mustard gas exposure for similar reasons. Finally, experiments were used to advance the racial ideology of the Nazi regime. One of the most infamous experimenters was Josef Mengele, who conducted twin experiments at Auschwitz in order to trace the origin of genetic disease and other genetic situations like eye color. His gruesome experiments earned him the moniker the Angel of Death, and his wanted poster is shown here on this slide. Following World War II, the experiments conducted on Nazi prisoners were a significant focus of the Nuremberg trials. Now, you may have heard of the Nuremberg trials before, and these were criminal courts that were overseen by major world powers at the time at the end of the war that were designed to hold members of the Nazi Party responsible for war crimes that were committed during the wartime. Although not officially part of the Nuremberg trials, the so-called doctor's trial was held at the same time. The doctor's trial was a criminal trial against 23 German physicians and medical administrators that was overseen by the American Military Tribunal. The focus of the doctor's trial was on the euthanasia programs and the concentration camp experiments conducted on Nazi prisoners. In August 1946, 16 of the doctors were found guilty by the court, and 7 were sentenced to death and executed the following year. One of the defenses given by some of the doctors on trial was that their experiments were no different from those conducted before the war by non-German scientists. The doctors argued that there was no international law on human experimentation, including no specific guidelines on what separates legal from illegal human experiments. Concerned with the accuracy of that argument, 2 American doctors developed a series of guidelines outlining legitimate medical research. The final list of guidelines was published in the trial decision of the doctor's trial and the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code established 10 points of guidance for researchers involved in research on living persons. However, the Nuremberg Code was not a law or enforceable statute. Additionally, it left oversight of human research to the people actually running the experiment. And that's a problematic stance because the experimenters may either purposely ignore the ethical dilemma, or they may be completely unaware of the ethical concerns because they're so embedded in the experiment. Nevertheless, it was one of the first formalized documents that outlined ethical principles of human subject research. Now, many students are familiar with the Nuremberg trials, if not the doctor's code and the medical code itself, but few have heard about the unethical medical research that was conducted here on United States soil. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, There was a movement spearheaded by Booker T. Washington that aimed to provide better education and vocational opportunities to Black workers, particularly low-income Black families in the southern United States. Washington opened the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama, in furtherance of that goal. In the 1920s, recognizing the unusually high rate of syphilis in the Tuskegee area, which was as much as 35% of the adult population, the Tuskegee Institute worked with the United States government to provide treatment for those infected. Now, this treatment consisted of mercury and bismuth, along with other remedies like exercising vigorously, things that we now know have no significant impact on the proliferation of the disease. Back then, however, this was considered the best remedy for syphilitic patients. Unfortunately, the syphilis treatment program quickly morphed into something that would go down in United States history as one of the worst medical research studies on our soil. After Wall Street crashed and our country struggled into the depths of the Great Depression, funding for national health programs was hard to find. And you can imagine that funding health programs for lower income Black families in southern United States was not high on the priority list. So the Tuskegee syphilis program was abandoned at first. But within a year, the program was reborn as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. The problem was that the syphilis study was not about treatment. In fact, it was the opposite. It was the study of untreated syphilis in the Black male. Europe had already published a study on untreated syphilis in the white male. So, given the presumed difference in racial groups, doctors wanted to see how Black males compared to their white counterparts. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study recruited 600 men from the original program, 399 with syphilis, and 201 without as a control group. These men were informed that they would receive the same benefits of the original program, which included regular treatments, access to free medical care, and burial stipends. But remember, this was a study of untreated syphilis, so the men were not actually being given treatments. Instead, the men were given placebo medications and diagnostic procedures hidden as treatments. For example, shown here is an image of a subject receiving a lumbar puncture, and that's an extremely painful medical procedure that's used to test spinal fluid for diseases, including syphilis. The subject was told that he was receiving back shots to help him get better, even though the procedure was solely used for diagnostic purposes to study how the disease was spreading. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study was unethical from the very beginning because the subjects were being lied to about what was actually happening to them. But these ethical violations were made even more serious in 1947 with the development of penicillin. Penicillin became the drug of choice for syphilis treatment, and it had a really high cure rate. The doctors on the Tuskegee Project were concerned that they would not be able to study the progression of the disease if the participants received actual treatment. So the study was continued without treatment or notification. In fact, study participants were actually barred from military service and regular hospitals, with warnings mailed to nearby physicians to refer all of the participants to the Tuskegee Institute for any medical help. Since the participants were never informed about the development of a cure, they were also never given the opportunity to quit the study and to get treatment on their own. When students learn about this study, most of them assume that this was done in a really secretive manner because the ethical violations to us seem to be outrageously apparent. But this was not a secret study at all, and people in both the medical and legislative positions were aware of its methods the entire time. The study continually received support from the medical and the scientific community, and in fact, Congress had to review the study every 10 years to provide approval for continued funding. In 1969, the CDC and the American Medical Society both affirmed the need for the study, and it continued as usual. It wasn't until 1972 when the research study was exposed to the public and the study is finally shut down. A whistleblower, Peter Buxton, had serious concerns about the ethics of the study, and he tried discussing his concerns with superiors going up the chain of command. But he was completely ignored, and so finally Buxton gave his story to Gene Heller at the Associated Press, who broke the story in the Washington Star on July 25th of 1972. Members of the public compared Tuskegee to the Nazi experiments in World War II, even as the Public Health Service tried to maintain that the subjects were volunteers and said that they were happy to see the doctors. After the study was publicized, Congress initiated an advisory panel to review the study procedures. Not surprisingly, the panel found that the Tuskegee study was ethically unjustified and that the knowledge gained from letting the disease continue untreated did not outweigh the risks the study posed for its subjects. Within a month, the Tuskegee syphilis study was officially shut down. By the time the study was shut down, 28 of the original participants had died directly from syphilis, and 100 were dead from syphilis-related complication. 40 wives had been infected by their contagious husbands, and 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. The following year, Congress held hearings about the study, and a class action lawsuit was filed. Ultimately, a $10 million settlement and lifetime medical benefits were given to the participants and their families. It wasn't until 1997, though, when President Bill Clinton finally offered a public apology for the Tuskegee experiment, and he established the Tuskegee University National Center for Bioethics Research and Healthcare. As a direct result of the Tuskegee syphilis study, the National Commission of the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research was created. This commission held a series of conferences over 4 years to discuss medical research, with the goal of creating a bioethics policy for the entire United States. At the end of their deliberations, the commission released the BELMONT report, which contained the commission's summary of the basic ethical principles involved in human subject research. Like the Nuremberg Code, these guidelines were not required by statute, but they were the first step in codifying research ethics protection into United States law. The BELMONT report stated that there were 3 basic ethical principles for any research involving human subjects. Respect for persons meant that research should protect the autonomy of all people and treat them with courtesy and respect. This guideline calls for researchers to provide subjects with truthful and comprehensive information about the research study and to allow them to determine their participation themselves. Embedded within this respect for persons is the recognition that not all people have the same ability to be autonomous agents. The BELMONT report stated that respect for the immature and the incapacitated may require additional protections, even to the point of formally excluding them from participating. The second principle was beneficence, which is the philosophy of do no harm. The BELMONT report added that when harm is possible, as it is with most research, then the researcher must ensure that the benefits to the subject and the research are maximized and the risks to the subjects are minimized. The most common depiction of beneficence is a scale, risks on one side and benefits on the other. At the worst, risks and benefits should be equal, but whenever possible, the risks should be lower than the benefits. If the risks are higher than the benefits, then the research would violate this principle. Finally, the BELMONT report argued for justice, and this principle is about fairness. Who gains the benefits of the research? Who bears the risks for the research? The principle of justice says that the experimental procedures should be designed and administered fairly so as to fairly distribute the costs and benefits to all potential research participants. The BELMONT report text reminds readers of the high costs paid by concentration camp prisoners and Tuskegee study participants, even though both research studies benefited those outside of the populations being used for the experiment. Now, physical harm to participants is a serious concern, but it's not the only reason that studies can be unethical. 2 of the most popular studies discussed in social science research deal with the psychological harm to the participants. The Milgram obedience study featured participants who thought they were shocking other study participants with serious electrical shocks. The reactions recorded in the original study show the extreme emotional distress that these subjects were under, trying to comply with the researchers' demands, but believing themselves to be hurting another human being. Even though the Milgram study did not involve any actual shocks or physical trauma, the participants experienced mental trauma as a result of this experience. Another psychological harm related to Milgram's obedience study had to do with the participants' self-image. We all want to believe ourselves to be good, decent human beings. And research studies that disprove our self-image can be traumatizing. The Milgram study, for example, was designed to explain the behavior of Nazi prison guards who argued they were simply following orders during the atrocities that occurred at the concentration camps. The results of the Milgram experiment showed that most people would continue harming a research participant when they were told to by a person in power, even if they didn't want to hurt that person. Imagine at the end of this study being one of the people that went all the way to the XXX shock, which was the most severe shock, and then realizing after the study was published that you followed the same line of thinking as a Nazi guard, hurting someone simply because a person in power told you to continue. That can be really damaging psychologically. The Stanford prison experiment also featured psychological trauma. One of the participants broke down during the study and had to be removed before the end of the third day. Here's a photograph of another participant, prisoner 819, who was released as well before the study ended. This photograph shows the participant breaking down as other participants chant, "Prisoner 819 is a bad prisoner," repeatedly in the other room. The Stanford prison experiment ended in 6 days, which was much earlier than the expected 2-week duration because of significant concerns for the physical and mental well-being of participants. All right, well, that completes our discussion of unethical historical research. If you're interested in learning more about any of these 3 studies I've talked about, I have videos and YouTube clips as well as some book recommendations on my website. You're welcome to look there. Thanks for watching, everyone.